Hello, everybody, and welcome to a Fane online production. I am Douglas Stewart, the author of Shuggie Bain, and I am so excited to be in conversation today with Andrew McMillan. Andrew McMillan is a poet who was born in Barnsley in 1988, which makes me feel very old. But his debut collection of poetry, Physical, which was called Physical, won the Guardian First Book Award. His second collection, Playtime, won the inaugural Polari Prize, and he's published other collections such as Pandemonium and co-edited Poetry, 100 Queer Poems. He is a professor of contemporary writing at Manchester Metropolitan University, and he is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. We are here today to talk about his amazing debut novel, Pity. So I guess my first question for you, Andrew, is with PPP, Physical, Pandemonium, Playtime, Pity, were you inspired by Kris Jenner?
Yes, you're the first person to ever work it out. The secret's out. No, I just always thought Physical was called Physical just because it was, I guess. And then it just, the kind of sad answer to it is that I just find it quite amusing. The amount of people that haven't realized, and then they suddenly line them all up and they go, ah. And I just quite like that. I like how they look on a shelf when you line them up together, but also just that challenge of, I like one word titles kind of feel nice to me, like aesthetically. And I also just like that challenge of finding, once you're kind of into a new project or you think of the new idea, is kind of pushing yourself to think of that word that could somehow like encapsulate it, I guess.
I love that. And I also think we don't ever allow writers just to say, I just enjoyed it.
It's just
It
fun.
brings me pleasure.
Yeah.
And that can always be enough. And so I personally take a big kick out of it. So thank you. Maybe you've inspired Kris Jenner, who knows?
That's it. Yeah, it's the other way around.
As it should be. So we are here today to talk about Pity, your amazing debut novel. I will let you sort of explain what it is, but it's a novel told from different perspectives, both from the point of view of insiders and outsiders, and it takes place in a Yorkshire town. It sort of focuses on three generations of men that are going through their own journeys in life and are all interconnected by either romantic or family relationships. Can you tell us a little bit about the book and the characters?
Yeah, so as you say, we've got these three generations of the same family. We've got what I've come to think of as the kind of granddad generation, I guess. So we get these kind of lyric interludes of people going down to the pit, the kind of monotony of that, the underground work of that. And then also the brief respite of things like working on the allotment and things like that, and kind of having that fresh air that job often kind of needed after you'd done that work. And then we've got his two sons. So we've got Brian and Alex, who had been miners, who lived through the strike, and who are now trying to sort of find their feet. In my head, Brian, the older brother, has done a slightly better job of that, or he's just found himself a little bit more. Alex, for different reasons, I think both economical but personal as well, is still really kind of struggling to ground himself, I guess, or to build the life that he wants for himself. And then we've got Simon, who's Alex's son, who is doing what a lot of young lads in their mid-20s have to do in towns like Barnsley. He's sort of trying to build a life and build just a stable income, I guess. And so he's working both in one of the call centres that sprung up on the outskirts of Barnsley in the sort of past decade and a half, taking bets for William Hill. He does drag at weekends in Sheffield, and as he describes it, kind of working mainly for students or for hen parties, and kind of doing not necessarily the kind of drag that he's that interested in. And part of his arc is that he's got a more kind of artistic idea of what he thinks drag could be, and he wants to kind of put on a drag show about Margaret Thatcher in the town. So that's kind of partly his arc. And he's also doing online OnlyFans sex work as well. And through those kind of three things, is kind of building a kind of career for himself, I guess. And he begins to date Ryan, who's a security guard who works at the Alhambra Shopping Centre, who has ambitions of being in the police, which is still in some quarters a kind of controversial thing to want in towns like Barnsley because of the strike. And then, as you say, these kind of outsiders, we've got these academics who are coming to the town to do some work around 50 years since a certain pit disaster that kind of echoes through the novel. And they're both running workshops with some of the kind of towns. So Brian attends these workshops, but they're also doing kind of more surveying, and they write these field notes that punctuate the novel that are just this more bird's eye view of the town Barnsley as it is now, but also I think kind of how it's ended up where it is, and the kind of socio-economic context of that as well.
Mm-hmm. And so was the town sort of one of the central characters then? Is that why you chose to look at three generations to get this sort of glimpse across time of how things change?
I think so. And I think, yeah, I think the kind of soul of the novel is the town itself, is Barnsley. That maybe is the kind of central character of it in some ways. And it struck me that to write about Barnsley now, you have to reckon with its history. You kind of can't just glimpse it as it is now. In some ways, it would make no sense as to why the town is as it is, I think. You somehow have to look backwards as a way of looking forwards. And actually, the novel form, it struck me more than poetry. That's what it can do. It has a sense of time in a way that poetry doesn't really need a sense of linear time unless it's a narrative poem. Poetry is just a glimpse. And so if I write a poem about an encounter with somebody, the poem doesn't really need to know what happened before or after. It doesn't need to know the rest of the plot. It's just that moment. Whereas there was something about wanting to investigate Barnsley, wanting to write this, that a poem couldn't contain. And it needed that space of a novel to expand out into, I think.
Yeah, I love that. Would you mind giving us a reading so we can get a flavor for the work?
Of course, yeah. So this is kind of where the novel opens in, and so I've mentioned Alex and Brian, these two brothers, who in the most of the novel are kind of in their mid-50s, really. But in this opening bit, we meet them as much younger boys in their house. The net curtain moved like a skirt as Alex ducked his head underneath to check the dark street. The magazine was thrown down on the settee, open at the middle, a slowly collapsing tent. The road and the room were quiet. Alex's hand was shaking slightly as he went back to the copy of Rustler. Pulling it towards himself with one of the inside pages, it fell open on a woman. His first thought was that her hair reminded him of his mother's. Flicking through the pages to try and rid his mind of that image, there were more women, sometimes in a bra, sometimes not, sometimes straw blonde with black roots, sometimes with their legs spread, some seeming to look directly at Alex or the curtains and houses behind him. One page had a couple who seemed to Alex to be colliding together like two kids jostling in a playground. It was like a comic book, he thought. Sequential panels where the woman lost her clothes and then the man. And in the final window, in the bottom right-hand corner of the page, Alex saw for the first time the female body. He leaned forward as though the image might fade. He remembered that the lad who'd passed him the magazine in school had said that this was the bit that really got him going. Alex had nodded along, not really sure what the boy meant, but knowing it must connect somehow to the strange heaviness he felt in his stomach as the man's trousers puddled around his ankles and the woman leaned back over a desk. In the corner of the room, the TV played. A man in a suit nodded at the camera. The theme music of the local bulletin started, and a somber reporter beamed in from a club Alex half recognized as he glanced up. He heard the word survivors, rescue, but stood up to turn it off, not wanting it to feel like there were other people there watching. Back at the settee, Alex undid his trousers and scooched them beneath his bum. He didn't know what to do next. He saw in one of the frames what the man was doing with his hand as he looked at the woman. He'd seen boys in his class make the same shape with their hands when they were shouting each other during PE. All Alex could think to do in that moment was hold himself. He slipped his free hand beneath his boxer shorts and cupped himself in his palm, the way he sometimes did when he was falling asleep. He thought he could feel his heart beating down there. The woman was hairier than he'd imagined she would be. So was the man. a thick rug of it across the chest and stomach. His ribs weren't visible from the side, but he wasn't fat either. It seemed to Alex that the man had an entirely adult body, and clearly one which drove women wild. That was the kind of body he'd get as he got older, he told himself. Alex didn't hear his brother's footsteps until they were right beside his head. He felt a hard right hand to the side of his ear. Alex jumped up immediately, pulling his hand from his underwear and sending the woman and the man and the rest of the pages of the magazine onto the carpet. "What are you doing, you perv? Mum will be home soon." Brian's voice seemed to waver more than usual on that last remark. They weren't used to being home alone this late. And when she'd hurried out earlier, grabbing a coat almost as an afterthought, she'd said they could get chips if they want. There was a bit of money in the drawer, not to open the door for anyone. "You little perv," Brian repeated. Alex began to explain about Tommy, the boy in his class who'd shown him the magazine and then let him take it home, and that he was only looking at it to see what it was, to maybe take his mind off things, you know. Brian cut him off mid-sentence. "She's well nice, isn't she?" he said as he picked up the magazine. It seemed, in the way Brian had asked the question, that it didn't need a response. Brian joined him on the settee and sat closer than Alex had expected. The magazine picked up now and sitting across both their laps. Brian continued to ask him questions or point out pictures using words Alex had never heard his brother use before. The extra years had given Brian a few inches in height, a deeper voice, and so Alex was forced to tilt his head upwards to check the expression on his brother's face as he flipped through the pages. It was one of deep concentration. After a couple of minutes of waiting for his heart rate to return to normal, Alex put his hand back down into the warmth between his legs and held himself. Brian did the same, shuffling to adjust on the settee. They sat like that for what seemed to Alex an age, one of them and then the other turning a page, using a finger to silently point out something of interest. At some point, Alex wasn't sure when, Brian reached over and put his arm around his younger brother's shoulders, in the same way he did when he'd scored the winning goal during a weekend's kickabout on the top field.
Thank you. What an opening. It made me think, who never wants chips if the mothers like chips if you want? And I'm like, always want chips.
Always.
But we'll talk a little bit about sexuality and how that changes through the novel in a moment. But I wanted to talk to you first about observation, because obviously this is the opening of the book, and here are two young boys sort of looking at other lives through a porn magazine. But that's a device that you use to great success throughout the whole novel. You know, everyone is observing someone, which is the novelist's life, I think. But the characters watch through a phone screen, they watch through a porn tab. One of the characters operates CCTV for the shopping center, as you said. And even when we talk about the community center, when we have these outsiders sort of really observing the people from the town and their histories, everyone in a way is being observed and is aware that they're being observed. Why was that important to you? What did you want to achieve there?
It's one of those things that kind of came out subconsciously, I think, in the writing of it. Like, in many ways, I hadn't realized that that's what it was about. And I mean, one of the great kind of fears of my life, or the great horror of my life, is to be perceived, is to be looked at. And I remember when I kind of said to my therapist that I had realized that this was a kind of subconscious thread of the novel, he got really excited because it felt like a breakthrough. Oh no, this novel's suddenly about kind of being perceived. And I don't think it's just that cliche that being from a small town or being from these kind of towns, you know, everyone knows each other's business, everybody kind of is observing each other. But it became about a kind of self-regulation, I guess, the way that towns and people can often self-regulate each other through things like gossip, through things like the fear of being seen. And so one of the very small moments of kind of observation or being seen is when Simon kind of recounts that another drag queen had sort of been filmed having a mishap on stage and it kind of gone viral. So this constant fear that in public you are now, because everyone's got a phone, kind of public property, and you're being kind of perceived in that way. I think also I think, fascinated by that sense of the hidden and the visible. And so with this kind of OnlyFans amateur porn work that they're filming on little standalone cameras, or they're filming each other, Simon and Ryan, on their own phones, this sense that, I mean, those scenes were deliberately, for me, unerotic, because what I find fascinating about that kind of amateur film is that people are never unaware that they're filming themselves. So they're checking their angles, or they're making sure they kind of got the shot right, because there's no director, they're kind of doing it themselves. But that sense of what you show and what you don't. And I think it also just became a solution of, generally what I would love to read is really traditional, or just kind of, literary fiction, kind of omnisciently third person narrated or first person narrated literary fiction. And I kept trying to write like that and kind of couldn't do it. I kept trying to be the novelist who was above it and looking down, and I just either didn't have that talent bank, or I just couldn't make that work sincerely for what I wanted to do. And so it felt like the only way to do it then was to kind of run around the town and almost like peer in at these different ways. And so kind of have these different angles to look from. And in doing so, learn from kind of different forms of literature, I guess. And so that sense of like viewing through cameras and stuff is something that comes from, films like Speed, I guess, to a certain extent, right? Kind of viewing things through CCTV. There's Sunny Singh's great kind of action novel, Hotel Arcadia, where a hotel manager has to guide a photographer through the rooms of the hotel using kind of CCTV and kind of live action mode. And so there are kind of, that sense of viewing oftentimes is a way in other novels of heightening tension. And I wanted it in this to be quite mundane, but just that fear, I guess, of that you're always being watched, and what does that, or always being perceived in some way, and what does that mean for your real sense of self? So Simon is a drag queen, both covering up in costume, in layers of makeup, but then feeling the most free and things like that. And I think, it's that constant sense of, of surveillance that places like that kind of give you, I think, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think, I think you do what you're so marvelous with is you do give a sense of tension. It's a very personal tension, because being observed often makes the characters feel very ill at ease, or they become very aware of the thing they're presenting is not the thing that the person wanted from them, which I'd love to talk to you about in more detail in a second, about that sort of working class expectation, or the gaze that is thrust upon us, and who owns the narrative. But within the community centre, he's aware that sometimes he gives an answer and it's not the answer that the outsider middle class academics and artists had wanted. And even within the porn that you write about, when they're making the homemade porn, he's very tense that he might be recognized, it might scupper his future career as a police officer. And so that idea of being seen comes with a huge amount of tension in your work. Even you write about cottaging, and you write about men cruising in toilets, and that's obviously part of the thrill of the sexual congress there, is that you might get discovered. And so that I felt, that the book actually was incredibly tense in that way.
Well, that's good to know. And I think, it's interesting, isn't it, with those, part of the tension, I think, for me as well in writing it was this sense of, like, I had to reckon with my outsiderdom in it. Like, I am that kind of middle class artist, kind of academic, kind of coming back into the town and like observing it from the outside. And I've done that kind of community work as well. And which is why I didn't want a kind of like binary, the bad academics are coming into the town and the salt of the earth people will show them what's true. And it's not, because it's not that. And that's not the reality of that kind of work. I think I was just really interested in the kind of inherent tensions of what that kind of work brings up in places like that. But yeah, like this, one of the things I was really wrestling with was that sense of, I don't know if to write something well, or to try and write about a place, you have to feel both inside and outside it. Or whether just to be a writer in some ways is both always to be inside and outside something, because you always observe, you always kind of slightly removed from it, observing it, whilst also trying to live life. And even kind of when we were growing up, obviously my dad's a writer, and so I grew up in a house of books, but we went to the kind of secondary school that was at the end of the street, or at the end of the village, that sort of had no music GCSE, art GCSE, drama GCSE. It's a kind of very difficult school in many ways, but I was able to get a lot of that at home. And so you kind of both within something and without it, in that sense, within something and outside it. And that seems to me to be also the condition of writing, to feel a part of something, a community or a place, but also feel always outside it or outside of the narratives of it. And that tension is somehow what fires writing, maybe. I don't know.
I love that. Actually, it was very meta as well, and maybe this is something we can talk about down the pub and not on the conversation. But I loved how you said you had a conversation with your therapist about the novel, and so you're writing about observing people, and you are being observed, and then there's the way that this sort of stacks together. Is sort of therapy and that the world of that helpful for you when you're creating your work?
I think so, and I think it's somewhere to kind of go with just the anxieties or the fears that that it would somehow be indulgent to talk to anybody else who you weren't paying to listen to you in some way, right? Or that there's no, I'm very lucky to know a lot of great writers, and we have conversations about the work or about the world of it, but sometimes you just want to offload or unburden those kind of fears. And I think therapy has been a really interesting place for that. I mean, I'm just a very anxious person in the world, but I felt much less anxious with a novel than I thought I would, because somehow there's a freedom in hiding behind fiction. Like my poetry is so personal and so kind of begins in the self and so exposing that every time it comes out, my last collection, Pandemonium, that was both about me and my then partner and kind of illness and mental health, it was so kind of raw or so personal that I remember it coming and just like throwing it into the corner of the office and not looking at it for like 6 months. Like I couldn't open it. I didn't want anything to do with it. I did maybe one event for it and just wanted to move on. And there's something really nice about fiction. Whilst obviously, you bring elements of yourself to everything. And I wrote about the town that I'm from. There's a joy in hiding behind fiction. And I was really determined that this isn't auto-fiction. That's not something I wanted to do with this. And so I write myself in as a little cameo, like a hapless poet turns up with a lot of tattoos on his arms and a kind of more generic accent to run a poetry workshop in the town. And so I thought, if like Alfred Hitchcock, I had like a walk-on part in the novel, then no one could think that I was Simon or Brian or Alex.
Yeah, well done. I picked up on that, and actually, I was going to ask you at the end, but maybe now's the right time to do it. As a poet, sort of making the leap to fiction, because last time I saw you was, I think, in April 2022, and you were sort of pre-publication. You were still working on finishing up the novel, and you were nervous. You said to me, this is unknown territory for me, and it's a new world. And when I was reading the novel, I felt the poet at work. I mean, even the passage that you read there's a beautiful rhythm to it. There's a spareness to it. There's the wonderful power of observation. But how you organize the passages too feel almost like poetry. But what was the sort of the arresting difference for you?
I think I remember when on a really practical level, I'd also just never written every day. When I was drafting the novel, I'd never written every day. And because poetry sort of happens in like the margins of a life, I think, in different ways. Like it happens on the way to work, on the tram, or you scribble it down in the margins of your life and kind of build it from there. And I tried to write the novel like that because that's the only way I'd ever written. But I'd sit down every few weeks and go, right, I'll have a go at the novel again, and then, what were these people called? Where was it set? What was meant to be happening? And so the only way to do it, obviously, I know now, is to you got to do it every day to hold the world of it in your head in a way. Like that was the only way to kind of constantly do it. But I remember when I first, me and my agent knocked it about a bit and it got sold. And the first meeting that I had with my editor at Canongate, and he just sat me down and sort of said, right, what's the narrative present of this novel? And I'd just never been asked that. I didn't know what that meant, really. Because like we were saying before, like poetry generally doesn't have a narrative present. And of course, what he meant was, we've got these 4 or 5 different sections. So one bit felt like it took a day, but the other felt like it took a month, and the other felt like it took a year, which is why now it's kind of all over the course of a week. And that's how you kind of get that tension. And it's something to do with that. It's something to do with narrative time. That's the real difference. That's both the thing I found the hardest, like had to get kind of rolls of wallpaper out and physically map out when stuff was happening in the different bits to make sure that it aligned. But also the thing that's the most exciting or the most kind of interesting, I think, about the novel form, that it offers that scope for change and for tension and for growth, because you just kind of have a larger period to play with. It seems to me that's the thing that I found really exciting, and the thing that's very different to poetry. So that my poetry certainly is always just a glimpse of something, a moment, but the chance to just actually stretch out a bit and kind of stretch the limbs of it a bit is something that I found. And I mean, it's still very short; it's like 32,000 words, but that's been kind of interesting to do, I think.
Yeah, it's actually amazing that it's 32,000 words, because the amount of perspective that you manage to get in the novel and the amount of different points of view that you can hold together is really remarkable, Andrew. It really is. And I think, just to sort of anchor our audience a little bit, you know, one of the most remarkable parts of the novel is around the grandfather who's a miner. And you keep coming back to a day in his life throughout the book, where he leaves the house and he goes down the hill and he goes to the pit. And then we get to see what happens in the pit again. But you go through the same sort of thing in a way where you feel almost the stifling of his life and the hinting at a possible dead end for him eventually. And yet it's written with such a poetry, it's written with such beauty to it for what is actually quite a mundane part of his life. What were you sort of showing there? What was important to you?
I was really interested to, I think, both show the physical reality of that work. I think the danger of places like Barnsley is that that people assume that there's a nostalgia for the work, when actually there's a nostalgia for the time, and it's a slightly different thing. Like, nobody in their right mind would want their child to be a miner, because it was brutal work, right? And so, like, my granddad couldn't walk from the door to the end of the drive without kind of stopping for breath, without kind of hocking up his lungs. Like, it's not work that you would want anyone to do.
Yeah.
But there is a kind of nostalgia or a feeling of missing what it was that work bought, which is like kind of good, honest work, which allowed you to raise a family with good money and kind of a sense of community, a sense of something kind of shared potentially. And I've always been really interested in that tension. Because it's a kind of, it slightly feels paradoxical. And I wanted to, I guess, show the reality of it, which is just the kind of muck and the slack of it and the kind of the brutality of that work, alongside the kind of repetitive nature of it. But also sometimes, I guess, like the surreality of it, in that it's literally kind of work, people were going about their lives on the surface while these men were kind of literally beneath them, kind of doing this. And so it's kind of oddly, not dreamlike, but surreal in some ways as well, which is kind of what the poetic elements of it are able to bring out. But the reason I kind of wanted to write them quite lyrically like that as well was I was just interested in that tension between, could you write honestly about the kind of physical brutality of that kind of work, or the difficulty of it, but in a way that wasn't nostalgic, or in a way that didn't kind of sanctify it in some way, but still treat it lyrically or beautifully, but didn't kind of beatify it. And I was interested in that tension, I guess, of was it possible to kind of do those two things to a certain extent, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, you feel the trucks rumbling over the top of the pit when he's under the earth, and all the things that you say, and it's funny because he's one of the only characters that doesn't have a sense of loss or a sense of pity. There is an enormous amount of dignity in the work and in the generation, and he doesn't, in a way, see what's coming towards the community and the world in that sense. But one of the things that struck me about your generational work was the sort of the opening up of freedom of choice, because in a way, your grandfather character has no choice. He does what is required of him to have the work and the dignity. But as we sort of open up to his grandsons and their lovers, there's almost a world of choice there, and they're still in many ways wrestling with that, almost wrestling with it a little bit more. I wonder if you sort of thought about sort of like freedom versus no freedom.
I think that's really interesting. I think there is a sort of sense that as we sort of move through the generations, so from the sort of granddad character to Alex to Simon, there's certainly a freedom um, of possibility, of kind of economic choice, and yet it isn't. Yet it is still restricted, and yet it is still. The academics talk about at one point Barnes. I don't think it is anymore, but the kind of one of the times of drafting, it was officially the lowest paid place in the country. So there is both a kind of economic freedom, but not in places like that. Like it's still kind of very restricted, I think, in terms of opportunity and things like that. And so, but I think there is an opening out, both and also possibilities of the self, of kind of sexuality, of who you might be in the world. And again, what it strikes me, one of the kind of myths of places like Barnsley that's imposed upon them, that then people internalize sometimes, is, oh, well, it was great back then because we had community. Whatever we had community, and now we don't, and so that's why everything's terrible. But actually, one of the things I was really interested in the novel was an expanding of what we might, or rethinking what we mean that word community to be. Like the academics go and visit a kind of arts program for newly arrived kind of migrant and refugee communities, where they're kind of sharing childcare, where they're kind of helping each other out, where they're kind of rebuilding their lives. Or even the fact Simon can live as a drag queen in the town, and they ask him to do one at the local club and things like that. And even the relationship between Alex and Simon as father and son, like it's difficult for Alex for various reasons that there may be spoilers, but I don't know if they are. But it's difficult for him to kind of accept Simon fully, but he does go and see his shows. He's not unproud is the word that I've kind of come to. And I just didn't want that, again, that kind of assumed relationship that someone of that age from Barnsley might have towards a son like that. And so I think there is an expansion and opening up of that word community, and also, the possibilities that they might kind of see for their lives, I guess.
Yeah. I think one of the reasons why your work should be studied is because it does look at community and industrial and economic change. And I think working class communities went through some of the biggest changes of the 20th century. But also you look at sexual change, you look at sexual liberation, you look at men redefining their masculinity through the book. And actually, one of the things I went back to read was Strong Man from Physical, because I love that poem about a man lifting his nephew. He's bench pressing his nephew, and as you say, I'll paraphrase it really badly, so please correct me. But as you say it, the thing to do when you're a working class man is almost to push other masculinity away from you in a non-sexual way, to sort of lift it up, but like move it away so there can't be any sort of closeness. But as we're talking about the sort of the socioeconomic changes that are happening to Barnsley, you're talking about sort of sexual changes and sexual choices and queerness sort of coming in and masculinity. Was queerness a sort of liberator in the novel for you? Was it an antidote to anything that felt like conformity?
That's interesting. I've always been fascinated in places like Barnsley, that like, I remember when Physical was first coming out, and I was asked to write a couple of pieces that were essentially like, we tell us how hard it was to be gay in Barnsley, but how books saved you and things like that. And I was like, well, I can write that, but my experience of it wasn't that. Like, I came again from a kind of very certain kind of family, right? It was very liberal, but my experience of coming out in Barnsley wasn't perfect or very easy, but it wasn't what you might expect. And there's a kind of once a week gay night where we would go, and at the Chicago Rock Cafe, and we were all 16, 17, 18. It felt like a way of kind of finding out about yourself in quite an innocent way. But I think what I'm fascinated by in times like that, or like with Simon's drag, for instance, is that at one point, I think he described the drag that he's doing in Sheffield as a straight man's idea of what a drag queen would do. And there's something really interesting about like Ryan working in these kind of quote unquote more traditionally masculine spaces, so wanting to be in the police, is a security guard, has a much harder time being open or being kind of himself. And I think that Simon takes this kind of Thatcher drag into the local working men's club, but there's something about the kind of hyperbolic performance of that somehow makes it safer, and that maybe Ryan feels that he's having a harder time being queer, but in these much more traditionally masculine spaces. And then there's the other kind of side of that that comes out slightly in the novel that I've always been fascinated by, which is in the kind of porn elements of it. So in the kind of OnlyFans content, they're kind of playing into a very certain stereotype of kind of the way that, say, young working class lads might dress, and which has been kind of commodified by porn in really interesting ways, I think. And so partly there's kind of that going on as well, as a way of, I don't know, making the thing that they might fear kind of safer, or making it kind of less threatening in some ways. So I think I just find it really interesting and quite complex, I think. I think the sexuality of it offers them a kind of freedom or liberation. And you can see in Alex, in a kind of middle-aged character, somebody who sees in Simon something freer and something kind of someone at more at ease in the world in a way that he perhaps wishes he could be. And the ending of the novel is, it's not like a happy ending, but there's a kind of movement towards a potentiality of that, I think, in it towards the end of it. Yeah.
It's hopeful, definitely by the end, yeah. I mean, it's interesting that you talk about sort of fetishization of working class lives, whether that is directly sexual or whether that is by the community workers that come and want to get to the truth of all that. But I was thinking also about fetishization and how fascinated we are with Margaret Thatcher. I was trying to think, this is obviously a working class preoccupation because she destroyed our life. She put in place policies that reorganize our communities, either for better or for worse. I personally think for worse. But then I was thinking it's actually quite a gay fascination as well. I was thinking about yourself, myself, Damien Barr, but then also Alan Hollinghurst, and about how many gay writers have sort of written about Thatcher. And it was such a fascinating thing that you take this drag artist living in today's world, and you decide that he is going to perform as Maggie. And the line is, "The turn is not a lady," which is such a wonderful sort of reappropriation of "this lady's not for turning." And I was wondering what it is about her that sort of stays in the gay psyche. Obviously, there's Section 28, and there is the horrors that she visited on people suffering with AIDS. But there is something, I think, that sticks with gay writers above all others in a way. And I was wondering what you thought that was, or if you had any thoughts.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think for my generation, there was something about a kind of a retroactive learning of or learning about things like Section 28. So like part of the drag act is him kind of narrating Section 28. And so kind of coming from somewhere like Barnsley, Section 28 got repealed when I was in year 9 of secondary school. So this legislation of, for viewers that might not be aware, I guess, this legislation that banned the promotion of homosexuality in public places, so schools, hospitals, things like that. So kind of realizing afterwards, oh, well, that's why there was no kind of sex ed about it. That's why X, Y, Z. And so I think for oftentimes there's a kind of, the interest comes from this kind of realization that that's what was enacting the silence. But then in places like Barnsley, there's just this kind of inherited anger about what was done to those communities. About, you know, it talks about it a bit in physical, but like the village Grimethorpe, which is like the village next to where I grew up in Darfield, was the village that was on like the national news when she died, because everyone was like in the street dressed as miners, burning effigies of her, kind of drinking pints. Like the anger and the kind of hatred is still there, and it's inherited because it can be felt by people who didn't live through the strikes, and we felt through people. You know, I was born in '88, so it's beyond my experience, but it can be felt by even people much younger than me as well. And partly that's anecdotal, so it just gets passed to you by people, but partly it's somehow just socially inherited, I think, to a certain extent. And the drag thing became a way of, so Thatcher never actually went to Barnsley. She went to these kind of outskirts and villages when she was campaigning to be leader, but never went to Barnsley. And so also just there's this figure
went to Peanistown, right? Is that what
it's called? Yeah, to Penistone, Peanistown. So never went to this town that is still kind of feels in some way broken by the policies that of the kind of that era. And so by putting her in drag or making this drag show about her, Do you find a way to re-articulate some of the impact that she had, or find a new way to talk about her, but then also talk about her as performance? So the masculinization of the voice, the lowering of the voice, the way that she had to hold herself, the way that she changed many aspects of herself, as many politicians do, in order to perform a certain role. And so then you begin to get into the kind of performativity of her as a person as well. And that became a kind of interesting angle to kind of play with as well, I think.
Yeah, incredible. I was born in 1976, so I lived through, and I grew up in a pit town, and so I lived through the miners' strikes and the introduction of Section 28 and all of these things. And actually, one thing you have in your novel, which is really wonderful, is Simon the drag artist performs "The Women of the Working Class," the miners' strike protest song. And for any reader who hasn't heard this, you can probably find it on Spotify, but please listen to it. It's one of the most moving, rousing things when you hear the chorus of miners' wives sing it. But I thought it was a fascinating thing because your book is entirely, exclusively about men, and yet at the center of it, as there is with many gay men's novels, my own included, is this woman sort of towering over us. You know, as you have the warp thread in the book of the grandfather miner keep going back to the mine, and that comes back almost like a refrain or a chorus. Another warp thread of the novel is this community outreach workers, are these artists and academics who come to town and who talk to the generation of fathers primarily about what they know, what they remember, what it was like, how it is changing. You know, you've said you've done some of this before as a poet yourself, and I did see you in the novel, and I thought, there he is. But I was kind of curious because I worry about this myself as a writer, as someone who comes from a working class background, and Shuggie Bain, you know, when people criticize it, they feel like it could just be sort of a celebration of trauma or a celebration of poverty. But what were you sort of getting at? What can you tell the viewers about that sort of insider and outsider, and trying to have a true narrative and then have what is foisted upon you?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, like I said before, like what I was really keen for it not to be is this kind of binary of kind of good and bad. So these kind of bad academics come in. I've done this kind of, as you say, kind of community engaged, kind of co-produced academic work as part of my job, as part of being a professor. And at its heart, when it's very good, it is about kind of finding new ways to articulate things that have happened, or find new ways of looking at stuff so that you can find new ways of imagining futures. And it's kind of core, that's what it's about. But what I was really interested in is this kind of like, what happens when my kind of liberal middle class assumptions or idealism come up against reality and the lived reality of people that I know from that town, people that I know because I grew up with them. And so one thing that I was really interested in was when the academics, one of the things the academics talk about is something that I would espouse all the time, which is about non-standard English. It doesn't matter how you speak or what you spell like or what your grammar is, everything's valid, and RP is just another accent that won kind of politically. But then they go, yeah, but we need to get jobs. And so, and it is true, both things can be true at once. The Ofsted are going into schools, and I've done this kind of work before where we've gone into schools where Ofsted have criticised the teachers for modelling quote unquote incorrect English. And so that's terrible. And therefore, what does that mean? But also, how do you tell people that actually the world is the world, and when they go into a job interview, their accent they will judge them for the way they speak, for the way they spell. And if we need these people to be able to get jobs economically in order to survive, then what does that mean? Like, that's something I'm really interested in, that kind of just the inherent tension, I guess, of those two things. Or the other thing that is a kind of amalgamation of two different things. I don't want to be sued by the artists, but these artists, he talks about a group of artists who'd gone into a school and had decided that they'd take down all the walls, that there wouldn't be any classrooms or any staff room, and that would allow a kind of more free-flowing kind of learning environment in a kind of ideal-like way, right? That's a great, like, why not, right? Yeah, beautiful. It's an idea that's been thought of by no one who's ever had to teach, and certainly not teach kids in some of the schools in Barnsley. And so a couple of the new schools were built like that. I was talking to my friend the other day, and she was saying her school doesn't have a staff room. And this kind of, which seems to me kind of mad, because where do you go to have private conversations or just to escape, right? And so that I find really interesting. And that kind of section concludes by them saying about that kind of Michael Gove thing during the Brexit referendum of we've had enough of experts, which people like Neil kind of, oh, how dare you say we've had enough experts, kind of horrified by it. It's like, well, no, that does make sense.
Yeah.
If you hold experts to be responsible for 40 years of X, Y, Z, then yeah, you've had enough of experts, and probably, as the paragraph says, also had enough of artists. And it's not in any way like a kind of Brexit book or a kind of post-Brexit book, but one of the things I was really interested in was just after the referendum, kind of in the couple of days after Barnsley voted, got 78, like massively to leave, kind of one of the highest voting leave percentages in the country. And I remember just in the days after that, just watching people on social media, kind of having conversations with people, and people that I'd always felt to be like liberal-minded and left-leaning and compassionate were saying the most awful things about people from places like Barnsley. And so this book isn't a kind of defense of it, but it's a reconsidering of those narratives. Like the day after the referendum, Channel 4 News went up to Barnsley to like vox pop people about why they'd voted leave. And they didn't go to the gallery or the museum or the independent boutique. They went to the places that they knew that people would say the things that they were kind of, they wanted people to say to kind of fit the narrative they were building. And in many ways, kind of people from places like Barnsley were being blamed for this thing that had been enacted by privately educated kind of bankers from the South who had wanted to settle an internal dispute amongst themselves. Like it wasn't the fault of people from towns like this. And yeah, so that sense of narrative is really just that there's an imposed narrative of a place always, kind of parts of Glasgow, kind of Barnsley, kind of wherever it is, there's a kind of assumed sense of somewhere. And what I've always been interested in, partly through doing that kind of community work, and I started in community art after university, so would work a lot with kind of young offenders and things like that, is like, well, what if your reality of a place is different to the national reality, in whatever way that might be, the national narrative? And if the national narrative is so heavy and so kind of loud, and you're kind of trying to come back the other way, where can that really go? And that's what I was really interested in, that kind of the tension of that there were, these academics kind of in the end, their conclusion quite rightly is, there's tens of thousands of different stories of a place. But like, where can any of them go if this national thing is kind of pushing down the other way? Even in like little ways, like one of the people that's at the kind of workshops that the academics are doing kind of says, it was the best time of my life, the strike. And partly that's bravado. I've been in workshops where people have said that before. Partly it's bravado, but partly they're talking about a sense of togetherness or community and things like that, or even a bit that gets a bit tense in one of the academic workshops where someone says, well, we never got a food package because we didn't know anybody in that part of the union, so we never got anything. And it's again these kind of sense of, where does the day-to-day reality of life, where can it go if there's something coming down? Say, no, it was both awful, but you all had solidarity. And of course, that's never kind of fully true, right? But where do those individual kind of stories push back to? How are we allowing them to come through or not, I guess?
Yeah. But I think that's what your book does really well, is it contains all of these truths and none of them are a central truth, perhaps. They're all just different perspectives upon it. I mean, the thing about the community workers touched me very deeply because I grew up in Glasgow. And before we moved to a pit town, I grew up in high-rise flats. And, these were a blight on the city. Most of the city was torn down. They built these high-rise flats, but they were built by middle-class, very highly educated architects who probably thought they were a wonderful idea. And you can see them sitting around in groups and sort of green-lighting them. And then suddenly you put working-class families in it, and there's nowhere for kids to play. If you're elderly, you can't get up and down. There's no shops, no library, no swimming pool. And so for me, I thought, this is this in action. It happens all the time to working class communities. But you're talking about sort of place and what we owe places as writers. One of the things about Shuggie Bain is I'm always being asked beyond the novel. I'm always being asked, but Glasgow now or Glasgow then, and
Mm.
everything's better. And the truth is everything is better, and then also everything is almost worse because people are still falling into too much addiction, too much poverty, and yet we don't have these big sort of other overarching things to blame it on, perhaps,
Mm.
other than people are really lost hope. So, you've lived most of your life in the north. How do you think living and working in a place senses or shapes your own writing? And then, do you owe something to the place you come from?
Good question. I think it can't help but shape it. Like I've lived out of Barnsley now for going on as long as I've lived there, kind of really. It's about half and half now. As I kind
You're
of
still in Manchester, right? You're
yeah,
still
so
in.
Manchester now, which is kind of where I went back home briefly after university, then kind of came here and settled here. Um, but I think it gets into your just the rhythm of speech, the
Mm,
kind of the shape of place and things like that, just somehow get into your bones in a way they would anywhere.
mhm,
And I've said this many times before, but for me, it was always we were just always raised to know that wherever you were from was worthy of literature. And so
mhm,
and the thing about places, and the reason why, say, I've always admired your work as well, is like it never occurred to me that it would be anywhere else, that it would be set, that it wasn't elsewhere, that it was where you were. I think
mhm,
was a really kind of key thing for me,
mhm,
and that just imbibed in us from dad from a very early age.
mhm,
And then I think in terms of do you owe a place something, I think you owe it when you have a certain visibility
mhm,
and when you have a certain loudness to your voice, which is partly for me familial and partly for the status that I've attained through writing and things like that, that you speak up for the people that don't kind of have access to those spaces. And I think that has to be twofold. I think that you both have to, like I will always defend Barnsley and kind of speak up for it, but then the danger is that you kind of speak over other people who don't have that access or didn't have that kind of childhood or didn't have that kind of lifestyle growing up or that kind of access to stuff. And so the second part of it is how you make space for other people to do it. And so through things like we're doing this with New Writing North, we're doing this Tempest Prize, which is looking for new queer writers from the north of England. And I'm hoping not just from the cities, not just from Leeds or Manchester, but hopefully from like Barrow or Bolton or Burnley, like these places that would otherwise struggle to be heard. Um,
mhm,
and and so hopefully also you pay back or you owe something by doing that as well.
mhm,
Um, because I'm aware that certainly in Barnsley, I'm somewhat of a unicorn in that sense. Like I just had a lot of access or kind of knowledge growing up that a lot of other people didn't. And I look at, say, like I mentioned, the school that I went to and stuff like that, like the difficulty of schools like that in that era was that the very very troubled kids or the kids that had really hard backgrounds often got a lot of support, quite rightly, and then we as the kind of quote unquote gifted and talented kids were kind of hived off and given a lot of stuff. And there's a huge swathe of kids in the middle who were very very bright, who were very good, who were simply ignored, who were simply kind of left to go under the radar. And so partly it's thinking like, well, how do we, what spaces can we make for people like that, I guess.
mhm,
And I've often been interested in this kind of, I've thought about it before, this kind of double silencing that
mhm,
happens because like sometimes when you try and talk about people from Barnsley, you try and kind of talk about these kind of issues around, people go, well, yeah, but it's all right for you to say that. And so, well, you shouldn't be, well, so yeah, but then you end up thinking, well, if it's not me, but you're not going to give space to these other people to say it or to make that argument, then there's this kind of double silencing that begins to happen as well, where it's both not my place, but you're not going to give that space to somebody else to say it. And
mhm,
so, yeah, I just think I owe it to kind of use my position and my privilege and that the voice to open up as much space as possible. I had a really lovely chat with was back in Barnsley this weekend launching the book, which is both terrifying but joyous, and turned out to be the exact same time as the pop star Tom Walker had announced a secret gig in the middle of Barnsley, just outside the library, which somewhat stole the thunder of the homecoming. But anyway, I was sat waiting for the bus to go back to mum and dad's afterwards, and just this young person sort of recognized me and started talking to me about that prize that we're kind of doing, the Tempest Prize. And she was just from Goldthorpe and just saying they'd had a lot of struggles. They were living in Goldthorpe, which is a very kind of economically depressed town. They didn't know kind of where to go with their writing, things like that, and that prize maybe opened that door. And so that kind of thing, I feel an obligation to the town to do, I think.
I love that. That's a great place to almost end.
Mhm.
Could we ask you for one more reading before
Yeah.
we wrap up, Andrew?
We've talked a lot about these kind of academics who are kind of coming in and doing this work, and they're writing these field notes as they go around the town, which in some ways are just a way of being able to talk about Barnsley in a way that real characters in a novel couldn't. So nobody in a novel can come and sit down in a pub and go, do you know, we live in the lowest paid place in the country? And someone else goes, do we? That's interesting. So they offer that, but this is their final field note as they're sort of leaving the town, having done this week's worth of kind of community engagement, as it were. Field notes on leaving. Our final drive out of the town and back towards the city train station offers us a chance for reflection. We are all tired from the work we've been doing this week, emotionally as well as physically, but we feel it's been worth it. One of our party mentions the importance of debriefing in order to bring together the strands of our memories into a collective recollection of the sessions. They make the point that, without this, there's a danger of fragmenting the lessons and losing sight of the common narrative. The drive takes us through a couple of outer villages of the town before moving on to a series of roundabouts which fork off into as yet unfinished industrial parks. One of our team says that if they'd arrived here with no knowledge of history and no sense of previous industry, it would have been easy to find out that there'd never been coal mining here. Every so often, there might be an incongruous hill, an odd undulation in the land, sometimes terrace streets which seem built to serve something, or small shoebox cottages for retired workers that hint at something, but the rest is erased, hidden, buried. We pass hanging baskets, each one bearing the name of a local business. We pass a sign built by volunteers out of brick that spells out a village name in black against sandstone. We are certain that the story a place tells of itself should be more important than the story that is told about it, and that the weight of the latter in national narrative silences the former. One of our team speaks up from the back of the car and asks, which story the town might tell of itself do we really mean? Isn't any attempt to coalesce or contain those narratives just another form of imposition? Anybody carving out small chunks of story from the wall of sound and noise and voice and memory is doing so selectively, and a small nugget of a larger thing should never be taken to be the thing itself. There is silence in the car. We seem to be in agreement. History, then, we posit, is both what is remembered and forgotten. It's the mention of the town in the Doomsday Book of the 11th century, and it's the hundreds of people who died in the 1800s in explosions at Hoyle Mill, at Lund Hill. It's the public hall crush and the children suffocating, and it's the explosion and the Secretary of State coming to say it might remind people, as it reminded me, that there is still a very high price in human life to be paid for the coal we get in this country. It's Wunwell Main, and Oulton Main, and New Miller Dam, and Grimethorpe, and Darfield Main, and Corton Wood. And it's the police taking their numbers off so they could kick lumps out of picketers at Orgreave and then lying about it. But it's also tens of thousands of people just trying to live. We propose that in contradiction to the popular sentiment. It's not so much that history repeats itself, it's that it crushes on relentlessly.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you for talking to us tonight, Andrew, and for sharing your novel with us. There are wonderful things ahead for Pity. I think there's going to be lots of nominations, lots of awards, and lots of really eager readers. Please pick up a copy of this, and also of Physical and Pandemonium and Playtime as well, all the P's. They're very easy to remember because they begin with P, which is great. But I'm Douglas Stewart, and we have been in conversation with the wonderful Andrew McMillan. And thank you to Fane Productions for having us all, and to you for tuning in. Be well and look after yourselves.